Microsoft added slicers to the 2010 release of Excel as a means of applying visual filters to pivot tables, upping the ante by making it easier for end users to filter pivot tables to meet specific criteria. In this tip, you will learn how to make your pivot tables even more powerful by adding slicer filters to them. To begin, we need to construct a basic pivot table. To do so, from the Insert tab of the ribbon, I'll click Pivot Table and click OK to begin the outline of the pivot table on a new worksheet. In this illustration, I'll drag the customer name to the rows quadrant and the calculated extension field to the values quadrant, providing us with a pivot table that summarizes total sales by customer. With the basic pivot table in place, from the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab, I choose Insert Slicer. As a note, if you're running Excel 2010, instead of saying Pivot Table Tools Analyze, your ribbon will read Pivot Table Tools Options. Choosing Insert Slicer opens the Insert Slicer dialog box, and in this dialog box, I will place check marks next to each of the fields that I want to add a slicer filter for on the pivot table. Clicking OK causes slicer filters to appear on the pivot table for each of the 3 fields. It's important to note that a slicer filter is nothing more than a visual filter for the pivot table. Quickly repositioning the slicers so we can see the impact of their results. As I, for example, choose to filter my pivot table to 2013 by clicking on 2013 in the slicer, we see that the results have in fact updated. If I choose just to see the customer name as AlleyCat Cycles, then we see that our pivot table has now been filtered to 2013 AlleyCat Cycles. Recognize that you can reposition and format slicers to provide added visual effects. For instance, I might choose to widen my first row and then click and drag and begin positioning the slicers at the top of the pivot table. With the slicers in position, I can also, for example, choose to shrink the slicers so they're not quite as big and therefore don't take up quite as much space on the worksheet. With all of the slicers now shrunken, perhaps I begin to further reposition them to space them out just a bit. And then, for instance, from the Slicer Tools Options tab of the ribbon, I can add visual effects to the slicers, such as change their colorings. With the slicers formatted, I will begin to remove the various filters that are currently applied, or change the filters that are currently applied. And you can see that as we change the filters that are currently applied, our pivot table updates in real time. For instance, now I have removed all of the slicer filter activities, and at this point I could choose to filter my pivot table, for example, to the 2011 and 2012 timeframes by clicking on 2011 and holding down my Control key while I click on 2012. It's very obvious in the year slicer filter that with 2011 and 2012 highlighted, they are my current filter criteria, whereas 2013 is not. Similarly, I could go to the Product ID field, click on the first product ID, and then hold down my Control key while I click on other product IDs, either contiguous or not contiguous, and now my pivot table has filtered once again. And likewise in the customer name, I'll just randomly select a few customers, and we can see that our pivot table has filtered accordingly. Slicers appeared first in Excel 2010, and they continue to be available in Excel 2013. Although slicers do not add any new filtering options, for many they make the process of applying filters to pivot tables much easier. Further, because a single slicer filter can impact multiple pivot tables, slicers help to filter multiple pivot tables and pivot charts to the same criteria, ensuring consistency and accuracy in your reporting. When working with pivot tables and pivot charts, you will no doubt want to incorporate slicer functionality into your toolbox.
On behalf of everyone at K2 Enterprises, thanks for taking time to watch this video tip. For more information on the training courses we offer, please visit our website at www.k2e.com.